Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today. It's my first time at the Millennium Forum. My husband's first time in Derry. He was up with me last night, so he's fallen in love with the city, so he'll be back. When Gary asked me to speak, he's from Limerick, so you know, there's stiff competition. When Gary asked me to speak at the conference today, he said he wanted me to come along, not as Kerry, the Chief Executive of Inspire, but as Kerry, who'd worked for many years in homelessness and addiction and mental health, and talk a little bit about what I've learned along the way. Well, I am Kerry, the Chief Executive of Inspire, but I'm also Kerry, the accidental Chief Executive, albeit I've been one for 18 years now, so you could consider it a major accident. But coming to talk to you today provided me with a moment of reflection. And I was thinking about my why and what is my driving purpose, and I don't think that's ever really changed. My roles, my learning and development have all helped me to change and grow, but my fundamental driving force, I think, has always remained the same. And I wanted to say a little bit today about what I learned in my first 10 years working in frontline services for people experiencing homelessness, and what I have been taught by them along the way, and what I think has helped me grow into the Chief Executive role, all being well. So this time, 28 years ago, nearly to the day, on the cusp of my 22nd birthday, so you can do the maths, I packed my bags and I set off to London to work with young men experiencing homelessness. This was much cause for concern for my parents, who were hoping for a teacher, but armed with my values goggles, more on that later, I landed in London. London was new, London was different, and I loved every moment of it. It was eye-opening, challenging, and a world I'd never experienced. Working in South East London against the backdrop of the Stephen Lawrence civil case, seeing the challenges for many of the young men I worked with, I knew driving for social justice was what I wanted to do with my life. And I think for me, this is when I truly found and understood my purpose. Working in a hostel wasn't always easy, and I found myself questioning some of the approaches very early on. Back then, it was a very traditional approach of 3 strikes and you were out. This didn't sit comfortably with me, and I started to challenge this at meetings, but didn't always get much traction. But I could certainly challenge it within myself. And I can remember one day having an interaction with a young man who was probably older than me, actually. And I don't even really remember what that interaction was about. But I do remember going upstairs, opening the drawer of the rickety filing cabinet and pulling out what was to be a final written warning. And I remember in that moment I stopped. I don't really know why, but I stopped and I thought, and I didn't do it. I closed the drawer and I put it back in. And I went downstairs, and I can't even again remember the outcome of the interaction, but what struck me and what I've always reflected on ever since then was the choice that I had and the power that I had. In that moment, I had all the power, but I also had the choice. So I could use that power, I could hold it tightly and use it to give a person a final written warning and maybe then become homeless again, or I could use it lightly and talk and take a different approach. So I went from London to Glasgow to do a Master's in Social Work, as Gary mentioned, and I continued to work in homelessness to pay my way. And after those 2 years, armed with my Master's, I headed back to London to work for Centrepoint. And this is when I realised that one size doesn't fit all. We need a variety of service provision. I went to work in hostels for people using intravenous drugs, and in comparison to my previous role in London, the work here was done on a much more flexible basis. There was an acceptance that people were going to use drugs, and our role was to think about how to support them, provide a safe service, and support them to behave in safer ways. This was really my first introduction to harm reduction working. I had a steep learning curve around injecting, overdose prevention, and much, much more. And whilst I was comfortable working in this environment, indeed I enjoyed it, I found myself perpetually challenged by ethical dilemmas. How could I ask a person for rent when I knew they'd already spent their benefits on drugs, and to do so was going to make them more vulnerable? What did I do when I saw domestic violence and I knew to exclude the perpetrator might leave both people homeless, as is clear one wouldn't go without the other? I was young, I was naive, but I had compassion and I wanted to do the right thing. And at times I had to dig deep to remember my social work training and professional boundaries. Working in this hostel really impacted on me. Some days it was heartbreaking, and I talked to a friend at the time about the fact that the people I worked with were often stigmatised, labelled, spat on, and worse. And yet I saw a tremendous resilience that I found myself thinking, if I was in their shoes, what would I do? It's difficult to empathise without lived experience. Indeed, at times it's even difficult to empathise with it. because we each have our own strengths and weaknesses, and we can only try to see the world through someone else's eyes. However, it isn't difficult to open up our very own eyes, and more importantly, our own ears, and to try to practice with true compassion. I continued to work in a variety of roles in London, managing drugs and mental health workers, and I learned then that recovery can be one step forward and two steps back. You all know this in the room. I was working with a young woman who was incredibly vulnerable, very physically unwell, and we'd worked together for weeks to build towards going to detox, which I was hoping was going to be part of her recovery journey. And when the day came, she made it abundantly clear that she wasn't going. My colleague listened as I sat with her, trying gentle persuasion. We'd worked hard to get that placement. It had not been easy, only to have it sabotaged at the last minute. She knew she wasn't ready, but I didn't. Being patient isn't my superpower. I'm not known for my patience. But my colleague reflected later on to me what she'd seen that day, that through relationship with the woman, she had taught me patience is required, changing my pace, my speed, listening to the person and putting them at the centre. My days in London came to an end, and I came back to Northern Ireland, still working in homelessness, but I found Belfast, like the London I'd encountered 8 years previously, was back to 3 strikes and you were out. I remember standing before a group of managers who managed hostels and saying to them, do you know, I'd be excluded if I lived in one of your hostels within 2 weeks, because I'm likely to have come back with alcohol taken more than 2 times, and I'm definitely not going to go for the 10:30 curfew. I moved to Dublin to head up a new multidisciplinary team for the health board, and this team worked right across the homeless sector, and I could see clearly that the problem also existed in Dublin. We'd set up services with a bar so high that those who needed them most were the most unlikely to get access to them. I started to think to myself more and more about the thresholds for service delivery. This is when I met an organisation called DePaul, coming from England to Ireland to set up cold weather services. At the time, a tender was issued to deliver a service for intravenous drug users in Dublin, and despite there being a whole range of providers in Dublin, no one tendered for it, but DePaul did. It was considered too high risk by the others, but that's how DePaul came to Ireland 22 years ago. After they opened that, they went on to open the first wet service in Dublin, and I remember saying to my mother, I'll work for that organisation one day. I was the director of services there for 18 months and the chief executive, and then was called to London to meet with the group chief executive, who asked me if I wanted to be their interim chief executive in Ireland. I was 31. I hesitated, and he said, if you don't do it, Kerry, I'll send somebody else and you won't like that. So that's how. So he said, sometimes a wave will come along in life and you have to get on and ride it or you'll be smashed. Thus, the accidental chief executive. I'll be forever grateful for my time at DePaul because it gave me a chance to work with like-minded people, to provide services differently, taking the learning from the people who I'd worked with, who had been multiply excluded, and to find myself in a position where I could contribute to doing things differently. To think about what low threshold services would look like. If we got people through the door and we made services more pragmatic, might we really be able to engage people in harm reduction practices? Many of the services that DePaul went on to open were the first of their kind in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and I was privileged to play some role in that. The lessons that I've learned from those first 10 years in practice, being allowed to walk beside people for a small part of their journey, taught me so much, and I believe that this has remained relevant to me over the years in my role of chief executive. Firstly, it taught me, and critically, hold power lightly, not tightly. You can really have a significant impact, or you can really do a significant level of damage. Think about how to make services more included and designed to meet the needs of the people who really need them, not just simply us who work in them. One size doesn't fit all. There is scope for abstinence-based services and harm reduction services. Continue to ask yourself the tough questions. Listen, really listen to the voice of those that you're working alongside. Is it your plan, your want, your desire, or is it theirs? Have patience. People will move at different speeds. As you know, recovery can be a forward and backward motion. People will move forward for sure, but they also carry the scars of the past with them, so be compassionate. Take risks, be innovative, hold hope alive, and be brave. 5 years ago, I became the Chief Executive of Inspire, and I was delighted to do so. As part of the interview process, I was interviewed by 2 of the people who use our services. I was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Thrilled because Inspire were including the people who actually use the services in the interview for the Chief Executive, and this gave me a strong sense that this was a job for me. However, terrified because I hadn't been a frontline worker for over 15 years, and I really knew that these were the people I needed to convince. Not just to get the role, but to know that they understood what my purpose was in being there in front of them that day. It was a fine balancing act. On the one hand, I was there to be interviewed for the role of Chief Executive, so I needed to answer appropriately, but also I wanted to be able to understand the personal concerns, and of course, I wanted them to believe that I was the woman for the job. The interview lasted for about an hour, and it was going well until a question came from one of the panel members who uses Inspire's addiction services. He said, "So why do you want this job anyway?" And so I began to answer, reflecting on my time working in homelessness, outlining the work that Inspire did in mental health and addictions, and how that was aligned to my own experience in the field, and how it would hopefully allow me to share some of my knowledge and skills in that area. And at the same time, there would be much for me to learn in terms of intellectual disability and autism, and also running a social enterprise. He interjected, "So it's all about you?" I was momentarily taken aback. Reflecting on it now, I was maybe a little wounded, as I thought that he didn't see that I was there because I really wanted to do this job and do it well for the people who used the service. So I drew a breath and I answered like this: "If I'm lucky enough to get this job, I can guarantee you that every morning when I get up and I come to work, I will be doing my very best for you and the other people who avail of Inspire services. But to do that, I think you will want me to be my very best, and learning and developing will help me grow and be a better leader for you as an organisation." He seemed happy with that. Well, he must have been, because here I am today. I was delighted actually to meet him again about a year after I came into post at one of our recovery support groups, and we had a great giggle about the interview experience. But for those of you who are in the room today who work in the sector, I wanted to say to you, it's not all about you. How could it possibly be whenever we do what we do? But it's not about you. You also do have to look after yourself. You have to bring your best self to work every day to be able to support people. And it's incredibly important, and it would be remiss as me, as the Chief Executive of Inspire, with our focus on mental health and wellbeing, not to say that today. So ask for help and acknowledge if you need help. The values goggles I mentioned early on are often what I refer to when I'm talking about leadership. For me, trying every day to be a values-led leader is important. And my value goggles are a gift my parents gave me. They were great role models. I'm fortunate, and my work taught me just how fortunate I am to have had them. The value goggles they gave me allowed me to go out into the world to understand it and to understand how to behave in it. Those were values of fairness, honesty, loyalty, kindness, compassion, doing the right thing, doing what you said you were going to do, and of course, keeping your feet firmly on the ground. For those of you working in the sector, think about your values goggles and your purpose, and how this supports you when you have a moment of walking together with someone in recovery. I hope mine haven't steered me too far wrong over the years. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day and enjoy the speakers to come. Thanks for listening.